It's time to start this session, Understanding Bowl Gouge Grinds. This session grew out of an article I just completed on bowl gouge grinds for Woodworker's Journal. And I usually do an article in about 2 days, 3 maybe, and this one went 5 or 6 because it became a kind of a sinkhole that the deeper I go, the more I found out. And I think I've uncovered quite a bit of history. And history is where I start any article I do because it's important. How did what we are doing today develop from what we did in the past? And I actually started out with this book, The Lathe and Its Uses by Claude Lucan, which was written in 1868. And it has some beautiful illustrations in it. There's a lathe circa our Civil War period. And as you can see, it's got these beautiful old line illustrations of an ornamental lathe in those days. And the principal subject of this book is ornamental lathes. There you can see they apparently forgot to put the poor guy's name and they had to write it, had to be written in. It was 1868 publication book date. But going back to this is the first reference. I have books going to the 1750s, but this was the first reference of using a gouge to hollow out faceplate work. And Lucan says on page 70 that the Tunbridge softwood turners would generally use hooks, but some of them were now starting to use gouges, and they reground a spindle gouge in a little different way. The illustration isn't very clear. It's typical of that period, and it really doesn't tell you much about how it was used or how it was sharpened. But we know that it was being used by professionals in the Tunbridge area in 1868. Jumping forward to a very important book that I cut my teeth on and came out in 1957 was The Practical Woodturner by Frank Payne. And it was the first pretty good turning book that taught amateurs how to turn. And in this book, Frank describes hollowing faceplate work, i.e. bowls, with a spindle gouge, but he doesn't call it a bowl gouge. He calls it a large spindle gouge made by Sorby. I have an identical one from my youth that I'll show you in a few minutes. But at any rate, he says that instead of being ground to a fingernail ground, it was ground bareface with a 40-degree bevel all the way around. We'll see that in a second. And if you jump ahead a few more years to 1971, Peter Child, in his seminal book, The Craftsman Woodturner, really made amateur bowl turning a great hobby in Great Britain and the United States and all the parts of the British Empire. And in this book, he clearly describes, and while Payne's book only had 2 photos of using a bowl gouge, this one has many, many illustrations, and he used the tool quite a bit uphill where we tend to use them level. We'll talk a bit about that later. But at any rate, it is clearly a bowl gouge at this point. He calls it a bowl gouge, and Peter Child learned to turn from Frank Payne, so his methodology was pretty much the same as Frank's. Peter Child had 2 sons, Roy and Chris. Both are alive, and I was able to find Roy and started an email pen pal friendship with him, and he confirmed a lot of what I've just said, and he also worked with Henry Taylor Tools to develop the first high-speed steel bowl gouge. There's the original Sorby that I bought probably around 1970. And as you can see, it's ground to a square face with a 40-degree bevel. And here is the Henry Taylor Super Flute, which has a Irish grind on it, but it is little different from the one shown in this book in the chapter that Roy Child wrote about him developing this gouge with Henry Taylor. This was brought out in 1976. And the original one had a rubber bumper on the handle, which this one doesn't. So now let's take a look at how wood likes to be cut. If we take a board laying on a bench and we generally, when we're going to use a hand plane or a chisel on a board, we try to read this grain right here and find out which way it's running. I'm exaggerating this a bit, but it would have a pattern like this. And if we took a simple bench chisel that was ground to a 25-degree angle like this, and we put it down here, it would be coming up like this, and we would actually ride that bevel, and we'd control the depth of the cut by rocking up and down off the bevel. We'd work with zero clearance in the tool, and we would be fine as long as we're cutting downhill on the grain. I always say we're petting the dog in the way it wants to be pet. And however, if it's like most boards, seems, and we get to a point further out in which the grain suddenly reverses and starts running this way, it's going to pick up these pieces of grain and actually lift them up and become a wedge and break little pieces of wood out. And that's a condition called tear out, common in woodworking. You often see it on one side of a knot or another in a board that's been through a thickness planer. This brings to the fact that if we're cutting with the grain or directly across the grain, a fairly small angle of attack, that would be what you'd call the rake angle of the tool. And in wood turning, since we work with a rubbing bevel, if we take that round piece of wood and we take the bevel, we put it down on the work like that and ride that bevel. And whatever the angle of that becomes the rake angle, which in this case would be 25 degrees with this chisel. But if we are going against the grain, raising that angle up much higher like this gives you much less tear out against the grain. And the common hand plane kind of epitomizes this. If we take a hand plane, we have a blade bedded at 45 degrees. So this would be the board. And we have it ground usually to about 25 degrees there. And that leaves us what's called clearance under the cutting edge. And so there'd be 15 degrees of clearance. And that's important with planes, saw blades, any power tool, router bits, and that makes sure the edge is attacking. A common problem with a hand plane is people take that edge and on stones they ground it till it's round like that, and it heals out and the edge never can attack, and they can't understand why it won't work. Router bits also come without enough clearance sometimes and burn everything they touch. But in wood turning, we work with zero clearance. All materials have an angle at which they like to be cut. That's Frank Payne's words. And again, with wood, the lower the angle of attack with the grain or across the grain, i.e. spindle turning, the better the cut. But going against the grain, somewhere around 45 or more degrees of rake angle is better. The hand planes still were greatly in the past made at higher angles. You had middle pitch, and York pitch, which were 50 and 55 degrees respectively. And although it's harder to push a York pitch plane, it will do much better in figured wood, just as curly maple. I have 2 York pitch planes made by Veritas, and they're a delight to use, but you have to eat Cheerios to use them. So we have Payne's original bowl gouge that was shaped something like this, which I just showed you. And again, Payne was able to use that uphill because he was working on a Myford, as was Payne, and he was working outboard. But here in the US, most of us pretty quickly figured out to rake that face of that tool back about 15 degrees so it was more, I made it too deep here, that's more like it, more like this. And by raking that out, we could hold the tool with the handle higher over the bed on the inboard side of the lathe. We didn't have the luxury on most American lathes of turning outboard. I would now like to show you a short video, it's about 17 minutes, that I did to accompany this article I just turned in. Nowadays, if you write a magazine article, you have to produce a video with it, because as part of the marketing scheme, they will put the video on their website, promote the article, and then the article has a link to the video to promote the website. So they work tandem. I might add that this video, when it goes on the web, will be in a YouTube wrapper. They put it on YouTube and then stick it in their website in a YouTube wrapper. And I then put it in my playlist on our YouTube channel, and you will be able to see this anytime you want by simply Googling the problem or using the search engine in YouTube. So within less than a month, probably, this will be online for anybody to watch, but you folks are getting a preview here. Hi, I'm Ernie Conover. Welcome to my shop. I'd like to spend a few minutes today talking about bowl gouge grinds. There's quite a few different patterns out in the marketplace today being touted by various turners, and I'd like to try to demystify this for you a bit. I'd now like to stroll over to the grinder and show you how to grind each of these grinds. This will help you to actually see which grind is best for you. This is a Sorby forged carbon steel bowl gouge that I bought in my youth. It was made sometime in the 1960s, and it is well described in Frank Payne's book of 1957, although he did not call it a bowl gouge, simply a large spindle gouge that was ground in a different way. It was ground to about a 40-degree angle and the same bevel all the way around, with the face being square. Later, most of us learned that by sloping this face back about 15 degrees, you could go inside a bowl a little better. But it's a simple grind that was easy to do. The way we did it at that time was to put a platform rest curve and adjust it such that we grind a 40-degree angle on this gouge. And we would simply put that against the gouge and slowly rotate it like that, doing our utmost to keep it absolutely square. It is still a grind that actually works quite well and is very easy to do with minimal grinding equipment. We're going to point it just a little bit uphill, and it's ground to 40 degrees, so that is the angle it will cut at. If you sight that nose angle in the direction you want to cut is parallel up the side of this bowl blank, we're going to put it right in like that. Get it cutting. I've got the nose bevel rubbing now. I'm going to turn it a little until it cuts sweet. A little bit uphill is best with it. And you can see this is going nice as pie. If I want it to cut deeper, I'm going to swing it towards you. If I want it to cut shallower, I'm going to swing it away from you. Just like that. Grinding jigs have greatly simplified the grinding of all turning tools, but especially gouges. This is become the universal jig amongst turners, and it uses a movable pocket right here with an articulated holder that allows us to grind a tool very easily and very precisely. Moving the pocket back and forth changes the nose grind angle of the gouge. Moving the strut up and down changes the angle of the side grind in relation to the nose grind. This is the 40-40 grind, so named because the cutting edge is raked back at about a 40-degree angle in side view, and the edge is more or less 40 degrees. It is exactly 40 degrees here and about 40 degrees on each side. And about is the key word here. It might be 38, it might be 42, but it doesn't matter much. A very useful tool for checking all this is an inexpensive protractor to put two 40-degree lines here, and we can fairly easily do a 40-40 grind. And this is, I think, interesting to people who would like to try bowl turning, but they don't particularly want to put a couple $100 into some jigs to do it with. So with just a simple platform that'll get you 40 degrees on the nose like this, drawing of two lines like this, we can now come in like this and roll the gouge as we come around, and then come over here, touch right there like that, and come back like this. I'll do it in real time now. So I've got it parallel to that line. I'm touching here. And I'm going to come right here like that. The 40-40 grind can also be done with the Wolverine jig and the Varigrind holder, although you will have to put the strut at kind of a weird angle to get the side grind right, but There we have 40 on the nose and we have about 40 on the sides. All we have to do is start the grinder. Walk it around nice and high. And there we have a 40-40 grind off the Wolverine jig. 40-40 grind, which I've shown you two ways to grind it. And again, if we sight along that nose bevel, it will go right up the side of the bowl. So we have to hold it at about that 40 degrees to this face. The fact that it's swept back 40 degrees also gives you a much longer cutting edge. So when your skills get to the point where you can really make this gouge sing, you can take a much heavier chip. So again, I'm going to come in here with a scrape cut. The flute's pointing to about 9:30, 10 o'clock. There's my start. And once I've got this nose bevel registered, I'm going to rotate it until the cut goes sweet. And again, I'm going to now swing it if I want to go shallow this direction. If I want to go deeper, I'm going to swing it toward you. It'll run with one hand if everything's right. It's a very nice grind. If you're just learning, a good trick is to just hold two fingers on the gouge so you're only holding it down and not pulling it with the left hand. For all the control of this gouge is by getting the nose bevel rubbing. That prevents it from being drawn into the end grain. If we tried to do it this way, it would be a disaster. And so we start the cut, we rotate the tool so it cuts sweetly, and it just goes along. So if you do it with just two fingers like this, you will get nice cuts if you're doing it right, and you will learn to make your dominant hand the control hand. In the 1980s, the Irish guilds, who had a strong local turning guild organization throughout Ireland that was well networked, developed a grind in which the cutting edge or face of the tool was raked back considerably more than 40 degrees. And that has become known as the Irish grind. With the one-way Wolverine system, which are and what they call their Varigrind jig. I simply call it a gooseneck jig, but with that we can very easily grind either a 40-40 grind or this Irish grind. And we just now we'll take a look at the Irish grind. Again, we're going to take that nose bevel, and that is the direction this wants to cut. So it has to be held about like this. And we want this so that if we put this level on the tool rest, it's at about the center of our bowl. So I'm right there. And again, start the same way, scrape cut, flute pointed to about 9:30, 10 o'clock. If we were making an inside cut, it would be to about 2 to 2:30. The cut's gone sweet. A drawback to either the 40-40 grind or the Irish grind is that inside a bowl, as you come down the wall like this, and come around this curve to create the bottom of the bowl, the heel of the bevel will actually drive us off course. As you try to come around here, the bevel bevel will force the tip up and off, and you'll not be able to get the curve that you want in there. So again, in the 1980s sometime, most of us started to take that fresh from the Wolverine jig, and we would simply by eye grind a secondary bevel on it here. You can see that I have, it's lighter here and it comes around and gets bigger here. But I can now, by sort of rounding that corner right there, or the heel of the bevel, I can come down the wall of the bowl and around a much tighter curve and across the bottom without being driven up and off our intended course by the heel of the bevel. Now we could go to the same grind, the Irish grind, but with a secondary bevel on it. I won't even put a handle on it, but it cuts just about the same. The first high-speed steel bowl gouge was released to the public in 1976 by the Henry Taylor Company. They built it in collaboration with Roychild. They still make this gouge. This one is of recent manufacture. Cutting theory says that the edge for faceplate work, where you're going against the grain twice a revolution, would be best at about 45 degrees, let's say between 40 and 45 degrees. And a problem with the normal pocket jig, where we put this essentially in the center of the grinding wheel and roll that, is we'll get a steeper angle at the side, no matter what we do. So Johannes Michelson, who is the first guy to think of turning wood hats, has come up with what he calls the vector jig. And we have a plate which has 3 holes center. You can sharpen spindle gouges on this hole, but for bowl gouges, you use the outboard holes here, and you do the right side of the gouge off of that hole, and the left side of the gouge from just beyond the tip over this way with the left hole. And then you come here and you can very handily grind a secondary bevel on the tool, and you can finally come here and grind what Johannes calls a tertiary bevel or third bevel. And that gives you a very nice sweep through here that allows you to go around sharp corners. It's a lovely grind. I've come to pretty much use it exclusively for my gouges. Michelson grind, which gives you closer to 45 degrees, but it's still pretty much an Irish grind, but with a secondary and a tertiary bevel. Very little tear out, which is when you go against the grain here in faceplate work, it's pretty common to damage the grain, either bend it or tear it out. So a good sharp gouge really eliminates that problem. I might also add that a common spindle gouge can be used to turn, but you would not use it like this, or you dig into these and create the rough patch from hell and probably rip the piece off the faceplate. But if we use it thoughtfully, and we can do that by putting this down like this, and again, we have the bevel trailing behind the cut, and you can see I'm getting beautiful shaving, and I'm not taking very much off. I'm just following the contours that I created with the bowl gouge. And I always quip that it's not if you sand, it's how much you sand. But with that little, what I call a trick cut, you pretty much eliminate the need for sanding. You can do the same cut on the inside, but you can only get to about here. You can't come around the corner with it, but that's where all the rough patches happen, is on the inside of the bowl, right down in this area right here. That same cut on the outside can be done with a bowl gouge by, again, raising your rest a little bit and laying this tool down on its side like this, so the bevel rubs, and sort of turn it down until it just starts to cut. And we can now bring that right along. And you can see I'm taking one continuous ribbon of material off of here. What I call the trick cut. But again, for a final finishing cut, it is safe as long as that bevel is rubbing behind the cut. But look what I'm rewarded with. Well, I hope this demonstration has helped you to decide on what you want to do. There's a lot more information in the article that is in concert with this video. And so pick up a copy, give it a read, and above all, be safe and have fun.
So Ernie,
Yeah.
on the chat, there's a question. Can you talk about flat grind versus hollow grind?
Yeah, and if we took a bowl gouge it would look something like this, and this is our grind here. And that hollow grind is actually the radius of the grinding wheel we ground it with. Now, there is a whole group of people who believe a flat grind is better, and I'm one of those people that believe for a skew chisel, a flat grind is much better. But on bowl gouges, I don't see that it makes much difference. You can learn to handle either one. But again, there are a group of people that do most of their sharpening or all their sharpening on a big 6x48 belt grinder or belt sander. And Sorby actually makes such a machine. And it has all the holders and everything, jigs, much like I've shown in the Wolverine system. And it will grind this to a flat bevel instead. And back in the carbon steel days, a long time ago, we would often touch up our edges after we ground them, because we had to be very careful not to overheat those carbon steel tools in the grinder, or we ruined the temper in them. So we would bring them close to sharp so that they had a little bit of a flat edge along here, and then we'd put them up on the headstock of the lathe and take a India stone and bring them to a sharp edge. And so by doing that, you got a flat bevel. And there were a lot of people that didn't have grinders, so they would simply do everything on stone. So, but my opinion is there isn't a heck of a lot of difference between hollow grinds and flat grinds in use, except in the skew chisel and the beating and parting tool. And that's spindle tools. Other questions?
I have not so much a question, but as a comment. When I first started being introduced to the concept of a secondary grind on a bowl gouge, I had, until your explanation today, I had no idea why you would actually do that. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Ernie, I have a question.
Sure.
You showed the 40-40 grind with the jig with the leg pinned all the way back.
Yep.
Now, what is the difference between that and somebody came out with another jig that was different? They said, I haven't really looked at it, but I heard there was a different type of method with a jig to get that 40/40. Do you know the difference between that jig and the way you just did it with a regular barrel grind?
No, I don't. I would imagine probably the Batties, Stuart Batty probably brought that because he's a big champion of the 40/40 grind. And I tend to agree with him. It's a really good beginning grind. And if you take the hotshot turners that turn a lot of bowls and do a lot of demonstrations, they'll use really long Irish grinds that are swept a long way back. And they do this because they can get a lot more edge involved in the cut. And but for the average punter in his home workshop, you're not going to take that heavy a chip. And if you start getting too heavy, you won't be able to control it. So this is a good grind for hotshot turners, but I don't think you should take an Irish grind for the average person. Let's see. Here's an Irish grind without any secondary bevel, and there's a 40/40 grind.
Ernie, I'm not sure I'm on audio.
You are, by the way.
Yes, I can hear you.
What grinding wheel grit do you recommend?
I'm using a, in that series I showed, I believe it's a 180. Let me walk over to the grinder and double check that. But that's an 80 grit on the right, and it's a 180 on the left. But I do all my bowl gouge sharpening on a 80 grit wheel, and I go directly to the lathe. I do not hone that edge. In fact, I don't feel they work as good after buffing them or honing them as they do right off the grinder.
Okay.
So Ernie, you've got a couple on the chat here. I'll just read them off to you. The first one I see is, doesn't a hollow grind wear down the steel faster?
Well, it is a thinner edge in cross section right at the cutting edge, but generally you would correct that by, in other words, if we looked at that in a very large view, it would be a little thinner in here than it would be for a flat grind. So the answer is yes, but generally you would simply correct that like so to get, it's not that back here, but it is right here at the end of the hollow grind. And of course, this is why the secondary bevel through here helps an awful lot.
And you've got another question here. Are most of the grinds you have shown are what are called fingernail grind, or is that something different?
No, that a fingernail is just anything that's shaped like your fingernail, and most bowl gouges have a fairly working man's fingernail. Now, on a spindle gouge, I will grind quite a long fingernail like this and a very steep angle like that, about 25 degrees. And I call this the high society grind.
And then we got another one here. I'm just reading these off. Ernie, did you extend the leg on your very grind jig?
Yes, because I'm using a 10-inch grinder rather than an 8-inch. And at the time I acquired that gooseneck jig, I only had, they only had 8-inch available. So I simply silver soldered a extension on it to bring it up to the height for a 10-inch grinder.
I have a question.
Yes.
You said you have an 80 grit wheel and a 180 grit wheel, but you go directly from the 80 to the lathe. What do you use the other one for then?
Where I do want a finer grind, mostly for spindle gouges, and I use it for scrapers. You get a better, finer burr out of an 180 grit wheel than I do out of an 80. So I use it for for ground edges on scrapers. But for bowl scrapers, I generally will grind them, then stone them, and then use the Veritas a burnishing jig to burnish an edge on them. If you watch another one on scrapers that's on our YouTube channel, it's there.
Ernie?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought the 80 grit was for grinding the profile, but the 180 is for sharpening it.
Well, that would be true for stone wheels, but these are CBN wheels. So a CBN 80 wheel just leaves a pretty good. And again, I'm convinced that actually a somewhat rough grind, like you'd have on a bread knife, when you cut through that end grade, it cuts through better than a really sharp edge does. If you take a really sharp knife and try to cut bread with it, it won't, nothing much happens.
Right.
Saw like hell and not much happens. And in some ways, cutting through the end grain of a bowl is somewhat like cutting bread. I'll mention a couple other jigs here. One other jig anyway. If you go to HaynesTool.com, you can buy Johannes Michelson's Vector jig, and you get that platform you saw. You get the holder here, and you get a jig that controls the extension of the tool out of the jig. And I might add that a number of jigs on the market rightfully say that you don't need a gooseneck here for changing the length, how far the tool sticks out of the jig will do the same thing as articulating a leg. So at any rate, a lot of jigs just work that way. This one you put upside down in their little fixture block, and then you stick the tool through, and there's a stop up here that stops it where you want it to, and it's adjustable for the extension. And you're actually tightening down on the underside of the gouge. And this jig is nice in that you can get all the way to the very end of the gouge. And I grind up about one bowl gouge a year, and it's just gone. And otherwise, with the Wolverine Varigrind jig, you have to grind a flat spot behind the flute to be able to get the full life out of the tool. Another great jig is David Ellsworth jig, which is very reasonably priced. It's probably the most reasonably priced jig on the market. And it has a little cross pin down in here. I don't know if you can, yeah, you can see that there. See that cross pin up in there? That goes on the flute. And again, this tightens from underneath, but it ensures that the tool is always oriented to the flute. And I like this jig very much. And David gives you a nice set of directions with the jig on how to build a wood pocket system yourself, which isn't very hard to do, incidentally, in your own shop. So if you want to get into using a gooseneck jig and spend the very least you have to spend, this is probably where the action's at. Other questions?
I answered this one, but maybe you should take a flyer at it too. What is a good source of CBN wheels?
Well, all the catalogs are carrying them now. Woodcraft to Rockler, Craft Supplies in Utah. There's a store on Long Island. What is it? The Wood Turning Store or something like that?
Yes, that's it.
Maybe if you send me their address, I'll put it out with the notes for this meeting. Then there's Packard Woodworking, which is in the Carolinas. They're a very good source, and they have Cbn wheels. Traditional hardware supplies like McMaster Carr or Granger tend to be pretty expensive for them. And there's also a website called Wood Turning Wonders. Ken Rizzo's the power behind that. And he has very nice CBN wheels at very reasonable prices. In fact, he makes a CBN wheel for a Tormek, and I think there's some Tormek people on here today. I don't know, I hate to say this or the Tormek people will cry foul, but I actually like Ken's CBN wheel better than the diamond wheels that they're selling for the Tormek now. But both are good. But I think he sells the CBN 600 grit CBN wheel for the Tormek for like $250, something like that. And I irrigate it, and I use Tormek's solution that is prevents your tools from rusting when you use water. And
Or we just lost the video.
yeah, I woke it up. At any rate, it's a good way to grind turning tools on a Tormek. And Tormek, if you're a general woodworker and you own a Tormek, it is a good system to look at. And you generally grind off the edge with a Tormek and not into it. And especially for gouges, especially a bowl gouge in which you're going to put a 70-degree nose angle. And that should be noted a little bit more here too, is that one thing about the Irish grind is that as I bought mine at the 1985 symposium in which Liam O'Neill from Ireland was there selling Irish grinds, and that's where most of us first saw it. But they generally come with about a 70-degree nose angle is a pretty well generic Irish grind. And then it moves up to maybe 40 at the two sides. There are people that grind different angles on the two sides. In other words, different sweep backs for inside and outside cutting, and they'll put a different side angle for inside and out. I don't get that sophisticated, but at any rate, that Irish grind, you'd use as much as maybe 85 degrees here for a very deep bowl with straight walls, would allow you to get around the corner at the bottom better. But for a nice open form, you'd grind this to more like a 40 degree on the nose with trying to get as close to 45 or 40 anyway on the wings. And the Michelson jig is so outstanding because it allows you to get pretty much a 45-degree edge along the two sides, which is where theory says that we would be best cutting against the grain.
I just, since there's so much interest on these CBN wheels, and by the way, I'm a convert mainly due to Ernie's coaching. But if you buy one, make sure you get one that actually has some of the abrasive surface on the side, which you'll find very handy. And some of them don't. And so it just, it's only about, and you see, unlike a stone wheel, you can safely grind a flat surface on the side of these wheels because they're not going to shatter. Yeah, I totally agree with that statement because
being able to stick a skew chisel or a beating and parting tool against the side of the wheel and get that flat grind you need for those two tools is immense. Also, Tormac has come out with a whole new system in which you can use only the side of their diamond wheels. And that is one advantage to their diamond wheels. They have a huge side on them that's covered with diamonds as well. And so you can do all of the same grinds you do with the face of the wheel on the side of the wheel now and get a flat grind if you want it. So that is an option of Tormac that's kind of exciting. Some years ago in a state of boredom at a symposium, we were all talking about the origins of the Irish grind, which led me to make a cartoon about its origins. And it's been attributed to a lot of people, but at any rate, I sent this as a Christmas card to all the editors and friends I worked with in 2015. But at any rate, any other questions?
Just one comment about using Cbn wheels. You could ditch your guards then on your grinder because you won't have to worry about wheels blowing apart on you.
Yeah, that's true. I running a shop where I have neophytes coming in. You notice that I still have the guards on my grinder, but I had to stick 3 flat washers between the 2 halves of the wheel, but I felt it at least still protected it. And I did it more so that if the grinder in my old shop was kind of in the center of everything and nobody could back into the wheel from the back side. I've also looked heavily through OSHA regulations to try to find if there's an exception for Cbn wheels to remove the guards, and I cannot find one. And so if you're running an industrial shop, while your statement is true, it may not get you by a safety inspection.
What about if you just remove the side of the guard and keep the...
Well, of course, that's better than nothing. But again, I would have no qualms about removing the guards if I was working alone in my own shop, and my grinder now is against the wall, so it's backing into the other side of it's pretty remote. But if I'm teaching students, I'd have that thing on there just from dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's.
I have a question.
Sure.
I think you just said that if you use when you grind the Irish grind, if you grind the nose at 40, you're pretty much getting 45 on the wings, correct? Is that what you said?
Depends what jig. If you use the Michelson jig, you're getting 45, close to it. With the Wolverine jig or the Ellsworth jig, you're getting closer to 40. But again, 40 is fine. It'll work okay.
No, so in your opinion, though, is it a big difference to go with the 40-40 grind as opposed to that? Or, what do you feel the advantage is, if there is one?
I think for most people, the 40-40 grind's a really good grind because for open shapes, the only reason you need a steeper nose bevel is if you got a very deep bowl. And so for average open form bowls, the 40 just performs great. It's easy to do. I kind of agree. It's a great starting grind for most people.
Hey, Ernie.
Yep.
I have a question. When you were talking about you kind of prefer a little rougher edge on your gouge, similar to a bread knife.
Yep.
How does that play against at least what I was taught, as far as like plane blades and chisel blades, where we work them sometimes to like a mirror finish. What's the difference in the cut at that point? Because they're both cutting, one with an extremely fine edge and yours with more of a bread cutter edge. Does that really make a difference in the turning, or is it just a time-saving measure?
Well, that is an interesting question. For all my spindle tools and all my bench tools, they're as sharp as, I can shave hair off my arm with any of them. But I have found, and other people have stated it from the mid 70s onward in any symposium I ever, that it doesn't seem to make much difference if you hone a bowl gouge edge, that you can pretty well go straight from the grinder. And I think it's the fact that you're going against that grain twice the revolution, and it really cuts down on the rough patches. I also think it might be part of the reason that we have to sharpen a bowl gouge. I mean, I can go if I'm turning the most difficult kind of wood that I'd sharpen, my spindle tools would be 3 times a day, maybe twice. Often I do them once a day. But if with a very sharp edge in your spindle tools, where you're essentially going across the grain all the time, well, then the sharpness really pays a dividend. But in bowl turning, where we're going against the grain twice a revolution, I think it doesn't matter much.
Someone asked about whether they could take the side guards off their grinder. I found this quote and I posted it in the chat that one of the key things is covering the spindle end, the nut, and the flange projections.
And that's from OSHA?
That was just somewhere I found on the website. Yeah, it pretty much was OSHA.
All right. Well, that's good information. And I suppose you could put a little strut on your grinder base, like a piece of 1/4-inch steel rod, and then turn a little kind of flat plate, cup-shaped plate that went over the nut and washer, and you just put that down on your grinder base, and it would protect you from the nut and wheel there. That makes some sense.
Hey, Ernie, I have a question about the Irish grind.
Sure.
The top part of the flute, is there an advantage to have an arc to that, or would it be better to have it straight back?
Are you meaning in this area right here?
Yes, where it's cut back on the top of the flute.
Right in here.
Yes.
And you're asking, would it be better to have a hollow grind or?
No, some people put an arc to that, or a semi-arc on the very top of it, rather than come straight back.
Oh, yeah, like that. More like that. The Michelson jig kind of does that. Some convex shape to that is good in that you won't get all of it working at once. But the downfall of most people that start out sharpening will take a bowl gouge like this, and I always teach beginners that our idea here is to have this so you could set a sheet of paper down and it would touch everywhere on this edge.
Okay.
And as beginners grind, they tend to put a Roman nose on it like this. And it ends up looking like this. And the problem is you touch here before you can get this nose bevel registered. Until this is registered in a stepped cut on your bowl, you would be looking like this as you cut in here. And until you have this flat spot that this can register on, you don't have any control. That's why you have to start with it in a scrape cut and then turn it with your dominant hand, clockwise for an outside cut, counterclockwise for an inside cut. And then this nose slides behind the bevel. And it is actually this wall right here that gets cut away. And it can't be drawn in by the end grain because it's sitting on the area you've already cut. Think of a pile of dirt and a bulldozer with a blade on it. Because the tracks are here, that is going to cut an angle that whatever the tracks are at, right across there. So it's the same with our bowl gouge. When you grind it to this shape, you now have the wings touching first, and it'll slide back and forth, go everywhere, be almost uncontrollable until you can scrape enough material away to get this registered, and it never cuts really good. So of all of these, I would rather that you could set a piece of paper on it. But again, with a Michelson jig, you can get some curvature to this, which doesn't seem to affect the cut as long as it's minor. And it may be better because you can't engage the whole edge at once.
Okay, thank you.
Ernie,
Yes.
you mentioned you called that the shape of a Roman nose.
Yes.
Would that make it an Italian grind?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. We have to play Capriccio Italian while we turn, which my camera went out again. Might have run out of batteries. No.
You're back.
I think Capriccio Italian was actually written by a Frenchman. But at any rate,
Another note to that would, when you make the Irish grind, do you use an Irish jig? No.
No, you use a bottle of Irish.
Okay. That's my.
Don't give up your day job. Keep your day job. That's all I can say.
Hey, I tell you, I get no respect.
Ernie, I have to laugh, Ernie. You say you're a cabinet maker that likes to turn. I think you're one of the world's foremost turners, and knowledge on turning is just over the top. So thank you, sir. It was really interesting.
Well, it's been a fun morning. I've really had a good time. And, having written probably over 1,000 magazine articles in my lifetime, there's some when you turn them in and you go like, well, I'll get a check for this, but I'm not gonna tell a lot of people about this. But there's others where you sort of feel you knocked it out of the park. And on this particular one on kind of the history of bowl gouge grinds, I felt I came up with a lot of historical information that is important to record. And, I was a young actor on that stage at that time, but Roy Childs is probably a decade older than I am. And it to find somebody that really was there looking over the shoulders of these guys was a pretty important find. And I was pretty thrilled with the whole thing. Any other questions?
Yeah, Ernie.
I'm just curious. I mean, it's the number of people on this call that are anxious to take the guard off their grinder, and I wonder why on earth they would want to do that.
Because you can't fit most CBN wheels within the guards of most grinders.
Oh, is that what it is? Okay, there had to be a reason. I thought, well, why would you expose yourself to that spinning thing when you don't need to?
Yeah. I somewhat agree with that. I mean, I went to great lengths to make sure there was a guard. Even if I wasn't teaching students, which I'm not at the moment, I still keep those guards on there. So there's a lot of things. I mean, if you're grinding a little tiny tool bit for a metal lathe, they're only that long maybe, and you're grinding them in all ways. If it slips out of your hand, it will go through the wheel and spit out somewhere. Again, having a guard, and in a traditional grinder, you have the wheel and you have the guard by OSHA can only have a 90-degree opening, and it's usually oriented about like that. But there's also what's called a spark arrestor right here that's adjusted down, and it keeps sparks from coming back and hitting you, which is important. And it also, though, if something slips into the grinder, it doesn't spit it out onto your arm. So it traps that. So all those guards have evolved over a very long time and aren't stupid.
Maybe it's strictly by happenstance, but I didn't have any problem putting the guards back on my grinder after I went to Cbn Wheels, and my grinder is kind of a garden variety slow speed grinder. I think I got it from Woodcraft 20 years ago, and so don't ask me why I didn't have a problem, but I didn't. It just all fit together fine.
All right, I think we have kind of beat this one to death. I am going to go to a once a month pattern on these from now on. I will be holding one a month, probably the last Saturday of each month. And I appreciate everybody being here. Always watch our YouTube channels. I am often posting things on there. So that's interesting. And our website, we've got to do probably 3 or 4 days of maintenance on our website right now because it's horribly neglected. And so Susan and I are going to be tackling that in the next week or so. So we'll be having information coming forward there as well. I thank everybody for joining me.
Thank you, Ernie.
Thank you, Ernie. Thank you for taking
Thanks, Ernie.
Thanks, Ernie.